Hey, hey. Jammin', Bob Marley. We like that. We're back. This is live from the Heartland, and we are bringing our first guest on. He would be the incomparable, the one, the only Flint Taylor of the People's Law Office. He has a new book out called The Torture Machine, which delves into some really nasty stuff that's gone on in and about this town for a long time. So, Flint, good morning to you.
Welcome back, Flint.
And
good morning. Thank you.
Let's just start off with, how did Chicago become the capital of wrongful convictions?
Chicago is not only and has not only been the capital of wrongful convictions, but the capital of police torture in this country.
That's even worse.
And I think the book, The Torture Machine, which I've explained, has two meanings. It on the front has a box, which is the torture machine that the notorious John Burge used, among other torture techniques, with his compadres on the south side to torture confessions from people, many of whom were wrongfully convicted and sent not only to the penitentiary but to death row. But the torture machine also means the machine, the Chicago machine, the political machine, dare we say it, the daily machine.
You could say it here.
We can say it here.
We hope it's disappearing.
Yes, we hope so, but can I throw a little caveat, a little pump the brakes a little bit?
Whatever you like. Go ahead.
Sure. Having had some personal experience with her back in the day around some of her activities in terms of the police board, in terms of the Office of Professional Standards, and also seeing a headline. Tell me if I'm missing something here, but she's going to keep Mr. No Code of Silence, Eddie Johnson, the head of the police department. That seems to me a major mistake.
While hiring a federal marshal to be in charge of her security detail.
I noticed that.
Further upsetting the CPD.
Well, that upset the FOP, which I'm always in favor of.
Upsetting them.
Yes.
Yes.
Right. Thank you for clarifying.
Yes. I'm afraid I have to ask a question about this. I feel like the police department has been on a pretty wild ride for the last 5 or 6 years, and that keeping Johnson is just a way of keeping it calm, at least for the initial period. I understand he's who isn't connected to the Code of Silence, who's been wearing blue for the last, all my lifetime in Chicago. Can we trust that people might be able to change their stripes?
Well, we like to think that, right, in the movement over these years.
Yeah.
In some ways, this book covers 50 years, and I'm afraid
They didn't change their stripes much in 50 years.
No, I'm afraid not.
True that.
But you look back to when Rahm had a chance to do some fundamental change within the department, and he brought up Eddie Johnson instead of some of the more reform-oriented people from around the country. We'll have to see if Eddie Johnson can change his stripes. So I don't know. He's just been in it for so long. It's such a fundamental cultural change that has to happen. Now, she's at the top. If she's resolute about changing the culture the way she wrote in the report, rather than the way she testified when I deposed her several years before.
Oh, we're getting down now.
Then we may have a reason to think that Eddie Johnson could change his stripes because he has to.
Right.
But if the entrenched power stays within the department, Eddie Johnson is just a figurehead for that power.
I hear you.
He's just a figurehead to let the FOP continue. And let's face it, the FOP has become more right-wing, if that's possible, than it used to be in the days of Burge and the days of Fred Hampton's murder with this guy Martin Preed.
Yeah.
Who was a crazy.
Crazy.
And now he's the guy who's the spokesperson for the FOP.
Yeah. Flint, your book, The Torture Machine, starts off with this really gripping chapter about the morning of and the unfolding of the murder of Mark Clark and Fred Hampton. Can you try to explain briefly how the death of Fred and Mark led to the end of the death penalty in Illinois?
Wow, that's I can't explain that briefly.
Yeah, no. Of course not. Really, that's a tall order.
But there is a thread there.
A little close to briefly.
Of course, there's a thread. And there's a thread with regard to the fight against police torture as well. The exposure of the murders of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, going from it being a shootout to a shoot-in to a murder, or murders to an
Assassination.
assassination was a 13-year struggle that I'm proud to say and humbled to say that I was a part of.
You certainly were.
And that struggle to get rid of Hanrahan, Daley the First right-hand boy, led to the election of Harold Washington. And then we see that, to some degree, that movement leading to Obama.
Did I ever tell you about the time I was walking down the street with Michael James? And Hanrahan was across the street?
I've heard, Michael's told me that, yes.
We were doing business for the restaurant downtown. That was the only thing that we ever went downtown for in the first years of the Heartland. And he spies Hanrahan walking across on the other side of the street. He yells right across 3 rows of traffic, "I see you, Hanrahan. We know what you did. We'll never forget it." And Hanrahan was like, looking around, trying to duck and cover. And I'm just sitting there going, "I know him. He's my partner." I like that. Anyway.
Yeah, that's too bad that's not in the book. It should be.
Well, you might have to do an updated
Yeah,
version
we might
someday.
have to.
I had a question, Flint. When you were talking about the Fraternal Order of the Police and their move to the right, we used to have in town, and maybe we still do, an Afro-American Patrolmen's Association. Are there any organizations, does that still exist with Renault Robinson and those people probably retired? What kind of counterbalance or what kind of movement inside the police department do you know of that might alter the Friends of the Police, the Fraternal Order of Police kind of conservative right-wing stance on things?
Well, the Afro-American Patrolmen's League became the Afro-American Police League, of course, and Howard Saffold, along with Renault, Howard Saffold stayed with his nose to the grindstone, or however you want to put it, from then until now.
Yeah.
And Howard is just a remarkable friend and soldier in the struggle. Pat Hill, a great woman police officer turned president of the African American Police League, who unfortunately is no longer with us.
Right.
So some of the older leaders are no longer with us, or have kind of passed into the retirement phase. And we don't hear as much about the African American Police League since Pat Hill left.
There were some brave people.
They were.
When they came out.
They were, and Howard and Renault spoke and said murder publicly about Fred Hampton.
Yep.
Howard stepped up around the police torture cases again and again, as did Pat Hill. She was one of the leaders in Black People Against Police Torture, which I talk about in the book. So yes, there have been some very brave black police officers. I'm sure there are still. But when you look at the consistent support for Burge, through criminal trials, through his firing, supporting him, you remember the attempt to have a float in the St. Patty's Day Southside Parade in 1993, after he was fired, Burge?
Right.
And that only the public uprising and the Sun-Times coming out and saying, you know, float for torturers, did they not enter that float? Well, they've continued to support Burge. They're the ones who fought for his pension after he was convicted of obstruction of justice and was successful in the Illinois Supreme Court. And Burge collected that pension till the day he died.
So Flint Taylor, you just brought up my people.
On the southwest
My
side.
people being the Irish, who
no
reading
offense,
this tome of yours.
He might have a little Irish in him too, no.
Reading this tome, it's hard to avoid the fact that so many of the agreed and go along people with this system of torture, of racism, of lying, and you know, is a bunch of Irishmen. I took the cop exam myself in 1975, long after I knew that they had murdered Fred Hampton, and it was, you know, I was reaching out to do my Gloria Steinem as a Playboy bunny moment. Katie Hogan as a cop. Until such time as they put you in a little room and turn you into a fire-breathing racist. But they caught me. I was a AAA candidate. I had an oral interview, and somehow they looked into my eyes and said, "Yeah, no, not this one."
And a year later, she helped open the Heartland Cafe.
But there have also been Irishmen who are radically involved. Our friend Kathy Kelly, many other Irish people who have been trying to offset some of this stuff. What about the collusion between the cops and historically the state's attorney's office? And what about the current view of the politics parade, which includes our new state's attorney, who is under fire right now, thanks to a stupid bunch of stuff. But Kim Foxx, who we want to keep. What about the new moves? If in fact you see them as new moves, with hope.
You did mention the collusion, as you called it, conspiracy, code of silence, whatever you want to call it, between the state's attorney's office, the judges, and the police. And that is the school to prison pipeline, mass incarceration of a generation or more than a generation now. All of that is linked together. So what Kim Foxx is fighting is that code of silence.
Huge.
The code of silence, the culture. It permeated the state's attorney's office at least as powerfully as it did the police department with regard to police torture.
That involving Dick Devine and Richie Daley.
That's right, and Anita Alvarez as well.
Alvarez,
So that's what Kim Foxx is fighting, that culture. She's fighting the culture of the code of silence in terms of the state's attorneys who facilitated and facilitate this mass incarceration, the torture, the wrongful conviction. She's trying to do things, and that's what's inflamed the Fraternal Order of Police, and that's what's inflamed the right, the entrenched part of the state's attorney's office and the police department, and that's what she's fighting right now. And they've taken this Smollett case as kind of a cudgel to try to attack her. They think they have something. Not because I think she handled the Smollett case rightly or wrongly, not because I think Smollett's innocent or guilty, but because this attack isn't about that.
No.
It's about the FOP, it's about the powers, the racist powers that are trying to get back into the state's attorney's office and get control again.
We're talking to Flint Taylor, author of The Torture Machine, which is quite a tome, may I say.
It's a very episodic, readable, if tough topic, and I think you did a great job as a lawyer in communicating all that technical stuff in a way that's very, very accessible, and lays out in considerable detail why we should have been more incensed a lot sooner. And I guess that's something I've been curious about reading this. Why was the public not more incensed at the trampling of basic constitutional rights?
Well, I think one reason that jumps to mind is who the victims of the torture and the wrongful convictions were. They were poor African-American men primarily.
Some of them already had records, so they wouldn't be sympathetic victims.
And let's not kid ourselves, not everybody was wrongfully convicted. They were wrongfully convicted in the sense they used tortured confessions, but we're not talking here, excuse me, about exclusively innocent people who were tortured. We're talking about people who were innocent of the crimes that they were charged with and tortured about, who may have been guilty and may have been innocent, and some who most probably were guilty, like Andrew Wilson. And that's how the cases came to light. And so I think that may be a major explanation. And of course, there are other explanations that fit in around the constellation, around the racism of it, the dehumanization, the fact of how police operate, whether they be Irish or otherwise.
I'm just curious to know how many people you think are in prison here in Illinois that really are wrongfully convicted. I mean, there are hundreds, there are thousands, are there tens? You got any idea?
Well, I mean, that's difficult, isn't it? Because you look at a case and what it takes to prove a wrongful conviction. You can look at the numbers of how many people have been found to be wrongfully convicted over the years, and you can look at those, and those are tens, 20s, hundreds, right? And Illinois, along with many of the southern states, is the capital of wrongful convictions. But how many other hundreds or thousands were wrongfully convicted in one form or another? Again, perhaps they may have committed the crime, but we'll never know because due process wasn't afforded them. You need the lawyers, you need the resources, you need all of that to prove a wrongful conviction cases, and most of these cases are 20, 30 years after the fact.
So The
That's very
contradiction is when we hear, despite that overreach of police forces, we have the murder solved rate is so low, you know? We have a terrible rate of,
If you want to get away with murder, it seems like it come to Chicago.
evidently.
Well, it's probably the case in a lot of big cities that they don't solve a lot of the crimes because the communities don't trust the police. Now, who are you going to go to? In a community where the police are just as likely to torture you or to beat you or to grab someone who's a witness and make them into a defendant, or just kind of laugh at the evidence that you have because you know, you're that Irish or you're that whatever detective who really doesn't care who you get. I mean, there's some really cold quotes in this book from Burge, which I won't repeat on the air because of the use of language, but it's basically when he's asked, how was your day? He says, well, okay for just investigating a bunch of...
blankety blanks.
Yeah, yeah, dead blankety blanks.
Yeah, right.
I mean, that attitude capsulized really, well, it doesn't really matter who we get. If we get somebody, now they don't even get anybody. Back then, there was a premium on actually getting somebody, and that's why they tortured people. Now that they can't torture them in quite the same way, they just don't. They don't get the cooperation, and they don't bother, and that's why the conviction rate is so low. I think one of the reasons anyway.
Part of the strength of the People's Law Office work over the years is that you've really relied on the rule of law over the foibles of men.
Amazingly enough.
And I'm interested in your reaction to whether judicial oversight that you were playing into is maybe becoming a thing of the past, that the courts are kind of weaponized to go after certain people of color and Muslims and even women now.
Well, it's a more complicated thing than to say that we certainly didn't believe in the rule of law. I mean, we were lawyers, so we had to use the courts, right? And I think as it plays out, you see the judges, whether it be J. Sam Perry in the Hampton case, or Brian Barnett Duff, or some of the many judges out of 26th Street who were former state's attorneys, who were involved in the torture cases as state's attorneys. We see a tremendous amount of injustice.
Yeah.
But that was the playing field that we had along with the streets, which the people that we worked with were taking what we were uncovering in the courts to the streets to bring that political pressure, to bring that popular pressure to bear to get some kind of, quote, justice. So I don't think that's changed. I think that I don't see the judiciary as any more fair than they have been in the past. There's a little more diversity in the judiciary as there is in the police department, but it's a fundamental systemic problem that we have that really isn't going to be changed by changing a few faces.
So part of the results of your incredibly important work, thank you so much for your years of dedication, was George Ryan, of all people, placing a moratorium on death penalty, on executing people in the state of Illinois. Thank you, George Ryan. And thank you. Where are we at with death penalty? Where are you at, Flint Taylor, with how to address our job as protectors of the people, and where does the death penalty fit in anywhere?
It definitely fits right. It's central. And if you trace the history of how the struggle here over decades finally got rid of the death penalty, that's a fight that's being fought quietly and not so quietly in different states across this country.
Yeah.
And each year we hear about maybe one new state, New Hampshire, whatever. And in the South, though, there are men and women on death row who are being executed.
Right.
And some of them are definitely innocent or have had wrongfully convicted more than not.
Right.
I mean, you think about Troy Davis a few years ago, but there are many Troy Davises.
Yes.
And so I feel like, even though there's no death penalty anymore in Illinois, that struggle is something that I have to support in any way that I can, and we all should, against the death penalty.
I feel like you're related to Brian Stevenson, who did the incredible lynching museum that is now existing, which I
was
hope to
just
see.
there last week.
How moving is that?
There's two of them. There's the Legacy Museum,
Right.
and there's the Peace and Justice Memorial.
And where are these?
They're in Montgomery, Alabama. And my wife and I went to speak about the book, and then visited both places, and then went to Selma. Went the route from Montgomery to Selma and the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and just so much history, so much, you know, pain in terms of lynching, but so much strength in terms of the fight that has been fought there and throughout the South.
Flint Taylor, how might the recently negotiated federal consent decree change the culture of policing in our beloved city?
Well, the jury, as we might say, is definitely out with that. We can look across the country where other consent decrees have been entered with mixed and varied results. It's no panacea. It has a lot to do, again, with how much the police department wants to change, how much the mayor wants it to change, how fundamental the changes are. We can't just have a new cop academy and think that that's going to change the culture.
Bingo.
We need to invest the money in things other than policing. Policing needs to be cut down, rather, at the very least, rather than expanded. We just had a shooting the other day down at the University of Chicago. Another mentally disturbed person who doesn't need to die. These are the cases we're seeing again and again across this country. Cops coming on scenes that we should have mental health workers at. Situations where they are acting like cops and how they're trained as cops, and ultimately that leads to killing that person. And those don't need to happen, and they happen again and again and again.
And again.
And again. And is the consent decree going to deal with that? Is it going to deal with racism? Who's going to enforce this? Who's going to be the monitors? What are they really all about? What is the judge all about? What are the people? This is all the kinds of things we have to look at to get any sense of whether a consent decree, a piece of paper, can change the culture of the Codis Islands.
Are there particular opportunities you think the folks concerned about police reform ought to be taking right now to make sure that the consent decree has some impact?
I think community involvement. You know, the CPAC has the ordinance that they're pushing for true civilian control of police. Community involvement. I think that you have to look seriously at the young people who are talking about things like no cop academy. I mean, just because you can very easily be cynical about the movements to abolish prisons or to abolish the police department and say, well, that's pie in the sky. But when you listen to the folks and what they're talking about, those are things that we need to listen to. It's not just that they're saying tomorrow we're going to end the police department or tomorrow we're going to end prisons, but that in fact the moves to get to that point and the philosophies behind that point, I think, have to be seriously respected rather than dismissed.
Great point, Flint. Listen to the young people.
Yes,
they are on the front lines.
Listen to the young people, but they should respect their elders.
Yeah, you bet. I hear you, brother.
I read this book.
I hear you, brother.
Yeah, please, everybody. The Torture Machine is an incredible piece of work, and you should definitely check it out. It's on Racism and Police Violence in Chicago by Flint Taylor, just in case you didn't know what we were talking about.
Well, thank you. Talking to me, Katie?
Well, I thought you were wanting to say something.
So how much has this lack of confidence in what the police are doing, the lack of trust on the part of the public, how much does this cost us? I mean, I know you're familiar with, you know, what judgments you've gotten, but even it was wiped out by a judge after you put in years of work. That's changed a bit. You're probably earning more than $75 a week, I hope, after all your hard work. But beyond the cost of lawyering, which is mostly not very lucrative, what have we been paying out as taxpayers to make up for the torture and wrongful convictions over the years?
Well, if we look at the torture cases, and only the torture cases over the last, 30 years, there's been somewhere around $140, $150 million in taxpayers' money that's paid out. Over 30 to...
Think of all those trees we would have had.
Yeah, just think about that, yes.
And classrooms.
30 to 40 million of that went to what our beloved former judge and mayoral candidate Gene Pitcham once called, quite correctly, pinstripe patronage. Burge was getting to his death, and Daley was getting to the present, the best representation that private lawyers could provide, paid for at private lawyer rates by the taxpayers. So we get to that 140 or 150 million just in the Burge cases, and then you look at the entire police misconduct cases, the wrongful conviction cases, and you're pushing $750 million. And a lot of that's going to pinstripe patronage, but a lot more is to help to compensate some of the victims, some of the survivors of torture, some of the survivors of wrongful conviction. And of course, as I mentioned, Daley, who was the beneficiary of some of this pinstripe patronage over many years, was at the heart and is one of the stories in the torture machine, takes the thread of Richard M. Daley from state's attorney when he knew about the torture and did nothing about it, but rather continued to use those torture confessions to send men to death row, to being mayor, and at that point to financing and to defending police torture to the day he left office.
Has
in
he done any
2011.
penance for this?
Penance.
Yeah.
Well,
That's a Catholic term, Flint.
I know,
You know.
I came up that way
I
myself. Quiet as it's kept.
The alleged $400,000 a year in pensions from various public funds, is that the kind of penance you're talking about?
No, no, but
Well, Dale.
thanks for keeping that in our minds.
Well, going back to Daley, you know, we did one of the points of the torture machine and also of our fight was not only to get Burge in judgment, but also to bring forth Daley's role. And the torture machine talks about that thread, and we were ultimately able not to get him indicted, not to get him charged, but it was always an issue in some form or another politically because of the way we raised it, and ultimately when he left office, and now hopefully this book as part of his legacy that is not spoken in quiet and polite circles, and that is his legacy involvement centrally in the police torture story.
Flint, we could keep talking, but I'm just going to fire one last thing to you. The impact of the Laquan McDonald case.
Major impact, obviously. We wouldn't have the consent decree. We wouldn't have Anita Alvarez pounding the streets. We wouldn't have many other things. Rahm, perhaps, wouldn't have left mayoral. All of that has happened because of that video, because of the people, those young people primarily, who took what was on that video to the streets
right on,
right around Thanksgiving and onward to the present.
And immediately following the Ferguson stuff, which was pretty strong.
And so you can't underplay that, but you also can look in a mirror with regard to Laquan McDonald, not only forward but backwards.
Yeah.
Laquan McDonald wasn't Fred Hampton, but he was shot down in cold blood like Fred Hampton was for different reasons, but nonetheless by a white police officer and all of that. And you saw that, like Edward V. Hanrahan and like all the torture people other than Burge, that the cops who covered up the murder of Laquan McDonald in the teeth of a video walked. And why did they walk? Because the judge was a former state's attorney.
Thank you.
And not only was she a former state's attorney, you'll see in the book, I had the dealings with her because she was the state's attorney who took the tortured confession from my 13-year-old client, my 65-pound Marcus Wiggins. She was the young state's attorney who let that happen and took the tortured confession. She then went up the ranks, state's attorney, judge,
and is there to let those guys go
and
free.
walk those guys out the door.
Flint Taylor, you covered the most important and hardest to cover stuff. We love you. Thank you for your incredible work.
I love you all too, and thanks for having me on.
You're listening to Live from the Heartland at WLUW Chicago 88.7 FM. Please like us on Facebook. And now we get ready for our next guest of this holiday weekend with a little bit of music from Funky Daisy.